Hi, and welcome back. It's Lynn, and I forgot to tell you this in the last episode, but today is December the 30th, just so that that's documented for historical purposes. Today I'm going to do a lot of reading. It's going to be a very educational episode, and I'm going to talk about diagnostics. Now that you've identified what your symptoms may be or your early warning signs, and it's time to go to the doctor, what kinds of testing might he or she suggest to you, and what might you want to request? So, once again, like I said last time, I am not a medical professional. What I'm giving you is the result of my own research, and a lot of that took place on search engines on the internet or on YouTube videos. So don't take my word for it, but this is what I've learned, and these are the pieces of information that I'm finding useful in helping me move forward. So just use it as a springboard of sorts. And I sincerely hope, as I do with every one of these episodes, that there's something here that makes things either a little bit easier or a little clearer or a little more comforting for you. That's why I'm here and why I'm doing this. If you are here for the first time, this is a personal chronicle of my own journey down the path to discover whether or not I have a neurodegenerative illness. I invite you to join me, not because I'm interested in metrics or likes or monetization, but because I am trying to connect with my tribe, and I'm trying to use this ridiculous whirlwind roller coaster that I'm on in a way that it seems to have meaning instead of just being a complete mind fuck. So if that resonates with you on any level, please feel free to come along for this ride and either like the playlist or subscribe to the channel. And I'm grateful to have you here with me. Today, I'm going to talk about diagnostics for both Parkinson's disease and for dementia with Lewy body. We have a lot to learn. There's a lot of research going on right now, and I am a huge advocate for involving ourselves, especially those of us who are at the very, very early stages of walking down this path, to make ourselves available for any clinical research or studies that may be going on right now, because that is how we get better at this. Right now, it does not appear to me that we are very good at coping with these illnesses. We know what is going on, but we do not know why it is going on in the brain. And very often, these illnesses cannot be formally diagnosed until after death during an autopsy, when the brain can be examined in ways that it cannot be while we are walking around and breathing. We need to do better. We can do better. So I did not find this personally very useful, but there is a website my neurologist recommended. I believe that it is called clinicaltrials.gov, and it's a searchable database for every study that's going on right now. At least it's supposed to be. But through the Michael J. Fox Foundation and the PPMI study that's going on with them right now, I will link that below. That's something that I found valuable. You can look at places like Cleveland Clinic and Johns Hopkins, and I think the University of Michigan may be doing some research in this area. Mayo Clinics, look around, search their individual websites, or just do a search on clinical studies or clinical trials for whichever of these illnesses you feel you may be experiencing. And I encourage you to be a part of that, because the thing I'm finding most frustrating right now is not being able to get firm answers and a clear path forward. It is so different for everyone, the trajectory of these illnesses. And to some degree, that may not get any better, because every brain and everybody is different and unique. And I have never been a big fan of big medicine and big pharma. In fact, I have a tremendous amount of resistance and distrust for them, and have since way before COVID, but that got pretty solidified during that whole fiasco. And what we have learned in the years since, my opinion, you don't have to weigh in on that one. That's not why we're here. However, I do like to understand what's going on in my own body and my own brain. And in this particular situation, as long as I feel like a partner with the people that have been given a position of trust for caring for me and diagnosing me, as long as I can have a voice in that and have some control over what is and is not going to take place, I'm willing to submit myself to the system and do whatever I can to get the information that I need. And I'm just inviting you to take that approach as well. So I did a lot of research and I'm going to read a lot. I've got notes and my eyes will be down a whole bunch. I'll look up and smile at you from time to time so that you'll know that I'm engaged. But I want to disseminate a whole bunch of information. First and foremost, how to diagnose. I mentioned a little bit about this last time. A doctor will hesitate to diagnose you with Parkinson's disease or with dementia with Lewy bodies unless you meet a certain set of core criteria. And you can have a symptom or two, but in the absence of meeting a certain number of core criteria for either one of those illnesses, or having one of those core criteria that is then supported by some sort of biomarker, the testing that I'll be talking about today, they won't make a diagnosis. And very often what will end up in your medical chart is a diagnosis called Parkinsonism. And Parkinsonism is a broad term, and that it encompasses a number of different conditions that have similar symptoms. So symptoms like tremors or stiffness or any other kind of balance issues, things like that, would fall under that general umbrella. And those symptoms can be caused by a number of things. Whereas Parkinson's disease is a very specific neurodegenerative illness that's caused by a very specific thing. That is a depletion of dopamine in the brain, as well as an aggregation of an abnormal protein called alpha-synuclein that has clumped together because it doesn't fit properly into the neurons in your brain, and then that becomes disruptive to the function of those cells and ultimately causes cell death in the brain. But those symptoms can be caused by any number of things: genetic factors, environmental factors, exposure to certain toxins, and some of those things are treatable and can be cured, whereas Parkinson's disease is progressive and degenerative and just worsens over time. So it's important to understand what we're looking at. And these illnesses are often misdiagnosed, which means that they wouldn't be treated properly. And it can take multiple doctors and sometimes years in order to get to what works. This is the primary reason that I am advocating loudly for you to be your own best advocate, to do your own research, to seriously evaluate what's happening inside of your own body. You are the best expert on you. So document, make notes, make them detailed, know your shit when you go in, and advocate for yourself. If you think the doctor's getting it wrong, go to another doctor, do some more research, show up armed. You're going to be your own best friend next to me as we go forward. Okay, so Parkinsonism might be treatable depending on what the underlying cause is. Parkinson's disease, not so much. So Parkinson's disease, the exact cause, unknown. As I said, we know what's going on. We know that the dopamine's been depleted, the alpha-synuclein proteins have aggregated, and that cell function is compromised. Why does that happen? We do not have that answer yet. So we're still working on that. And because we don't know why, it's a lot harder to know what to do to prevent. All we can do is address your symptoms, my symptoms, and do the best we can to make ourselves as comfortable and functional as possible for as long as possible, with the knowledge that we are facing a degenerative and progressive illness. So as far as causes, there's some evidence to suggest that there might be some genetic factors. So there are several genes that have been linked to an increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease. Family history is relevant. So if you have first-degree relatives, that would be a sibling or a parent, possibly a grandparent, having Parkinson's disease, then you would be at higher risk for developing it. We do know that. There are also environmental factors. So exposure to certain pesticides. There's actually a part of the country in the Midwest known as the Parkinson's Belt because of the farmland that's there and certain pesticides that were used or herbicides in those areas that ultimately led to a greatly increased number of people who subsequently developed Parkinson's disease. Heavy metals exposure or absorption of heavy metals, certain antipsychotic medications or other medications, even SSRIs and things like that. Certain medications, there's something actually called drug-induced Parkinsonism, but Parkinsonism that's caused by exposure to certain toxins or certain medications can actually be dealt with. That doesn't mean you couldn't develop Parkinson's disease at some other point in the future. And that's what creates the confusion. It's like, oh, you have these Parkinsonism symptoms. Oh, you've been exposed to a certain toxin. Let's treat that and see if it gets better. If it gets better, then you had, you know, Parkinsonism that was caused by that thing, and you'll go on and live your life. If it doesn't get better, it's like, oh, okay, then that is actually an indication that the toxin actually caused Parkinson's disease. There's some gray area there. There's some confusion there. At least there is in me. Maybe I didn't do a good job of representing the data, but that's my understanding at this point. There is some understanding that head trauma may play a role. And in my case, there have been 3 separate incidences in my life, a car accident, a horse accident, and a fall, a very bad fall, all of which resulted in head injury. And so even though those were all decades and decades ago, there is a connection there that at some point later in life, maybe much later in life, it can lead to the development of Parkinson's disease. And as far as the medications that I was mentioning earlier, there are some studies that are suggesting that medications like calcium channel blockers, SSRIs, SNRIs, so serotonin or epinephrine reuptake inhibitors, anti-nausea meds, GI motility meds, antipsychotics, anticonvulsants can either cause or worsen Parkinsonism, but Parkinsonism can actually be overcome by discontinuing those meds, and you should get better in about 4 to 18 months. So if the medications are causing the problem and you have drug-induced Parkinsonism, you want to detox, even though this is kind of falling under the umbrella of maybe it could result in full-blown Parkinson's developing. We don't know. At least that's my understanding of what I've read. Other possible factors that could lead to this is your age. Older adults over the age of 60 are much more likely to begin to develop Parkinson's disease than younger people. That's not always the case. I've bumped into a couple of people that are significantly younger than that in some of the Parkinson's support groups that I have joined on social media, who are much younger than that. And of course, Michael J. Fox, I believe, was 29 when he was diagnosed and has been living with Parkinson's disease for decades. And I cannot begin to tell you the amount of respect and awe that I have for him and his journey. Men are more likely to develop Parkinson's disease than women. However, women tend to be more vocal on social media, so I am finding at least a 50-50, and in some cases more women being vocal and reaching out for support and a community who are struggling with some of these symptoms. And so shout out to the guys out there. Dudes, you're not alone. Reach. It's helpful to link arms. Yeah, I'd like to see some more of that happening. By the way, it's very important to note that most people with Parkinson's, most, do not have a known genetic or environmental cause. So if a genetic marker has not been found or an environmental cause like an exposure to a toxin has not been found, then you would be diagnosed with what's called idiopathic Parkinson's or Parkinsonism. And that is idiopathic just means there it is. It's not attached to anything. It's unique and there is no obvious cause. Moving on to dementia. It's a general term, dementia, for a group of conditions that's caused by a decline in cognitive function of some kind. That would be your memory, your thinking, your reasoning. And there are several different types of dementia. They are different in terms of what causes them, and they are very different in terms of how to treat them. So this is Lewy body dementia is the one that is associated with Parkinson's disease because it has to do with the very same protein, the alpha-synuclein protein, being in the way, being disruptive to a cell function, whereas other proteins and other causes will cause other kinds of dementia. So getting to the bottom of that without good diagnostics can be a challenge. So the more you know about these things, the better it will be when it comes time to partner with your care team to figure out how to move forward. So least associated with the illnesses that we're talking about here is something called vascular dementia. And vascular dementia is caused by damage to the blood vessels in the brain, and that subsequently reduces blood flow and oxygen to the brain. So, my takeaway from that is that that is from injury of some kind, I would think. I didn't do a deep dive into that because it wasn't really deeply attached to what we're talking about here. When we think about dementia, of course, those terms are often used synonymously and incorrectly so with Alzheimer's disease. One form of dementia would be Alzheimer's disease, but there are other dementias like Lewy body dementia that are not Alzheimer's, but dementia comes in many flavors. Alzheimer's disease also is caused by an abnormal protein aggregating in the brain, but those are not the alpha synuclein proteins. They are amyloid plaques and tau tangles. Amyloid and tau are names of protein molecules, as I understand it. Again, I may have gotten some details wrong somewhere along the way, but I'm doing my best for you here. Lewy body dementia, characterized by deposits of alpha synuclein in the brain. So if we can show that diagnostically and clinically, we've pretty much sealed the deal. We know what we're dealing with. And unfortunately, because of the various ways that these symptoms can present and the various knowledge levels of doctors and what their expertise is, if you don't have the like I went in to see my neurologist with REM sleep behavior disorder. That immediately triggered thoughts of, okay, that's attached to Parkinson's or Lewy body dementia. So we're looking for alpha synucleins. If I had come in with just some cognitive or memory issues, there would be a whole menu of places to start. Well, we should look for Alzheimer's. We should look for this. We should look for that. Maybe it's natural aging and there's no neurodegeneration. Maybe there's a brain injury. And we would have to go through a whole series of tests before we would even get to the point of knowing that we would be looking for alpha synuclein. So I kind of took the short path. But it typically takes at least 3 doctors in order to get to a correct diagnosis. And Lewy body dementia is the most misdiagnosed dementia in the country, according to one source that I read. There's another called frontotemporal dementia, and that affects the frontal and temporal lobes of the brain, obviously, and that leads to changes in behavior and personality and language. So that can be genetic, family history is relevant, and those abnormal proteins like Alzheimer's would be tau, and there's another protein called TDP43. Those will accumulate in the brain and damage the nerve cells. And again, we don't know the mechanism for that. We know that it happens. We don't know why it happens. People with Parkinson's disease and MS are actually at a higher risk for developing frontotemporal dementia. So it's really important to be able to distinguish, are we talking about frontotemporal dementia or are we talking about dementia with Lewy bodies? So again, looking for those Lewy bodies, which is what we call those clumps of alpha-synuclein proteins. That's key to understanding exactly what it is that we're dealing with. Other causes of dementia: head trauma, stroke, brain tumors, infections like HIV or syphilis. There's genetic factors, medications, alcohol abuse, nutritional deficiency. And some people can have a combination of factors. Some people have some Parkinsonian factors and some have only cognitive. It is such a menu of options for how this collection of symptoms will manifest. When did it start for you? Which happened first, in what order? How old were you? What gender are you? What Where did you live? What were you exposed to? What has happened in the whole rest of your life? And this is what I'm most interested in. I would love to know who's interested in the clinical research field and talking to me about what my life has been like all along. Does my bipolar disorder that I've had since I'm in my 20s have anything to do with this? Do the head injuries that I've had have anything to do with this? Does when these things happened and in what order have anything to do with this? Here, I'll give you my data. I'll give you my information. I want to know as much as you do. I just hope there's somebody out there who wants to know as much as I do. If you know of any clinical studies that I haven't mentioned or sources for finding them, I would love to hear about that in the comments. And the more information you can give me, the happier I will be. So chime in, please. So, diagnostics. We have an understanding now of what is Lewy body dementia, what other kind of dementias are there, and what is Parkinsonism and what is Parkinson's disease. This is the pot that we're going to draw from to see what ticket number we got, to see if we won the freaking lottery. I'm a little salty today in my language. Not sorry. Diagnostics. Now that we have a set of symptoms and a set of names for a set of illnesses, how are we going to narrow that down and get to the bottom of it? Step number one should be what's called a complete neurological examination. My doctor did what I would consider to be a cursory neurological examination in the office, but it could be more complete, especially if you have diverse symptoms that don't obviously point to one particular condition. So in my case, REM sleep behavior disorder was the thing that I went in to talk about, and that points very clearly toward dementia with Lewy bodies or Parkinson's disease. So there was no need to fool around trying to figure out what direction to go in. We went straight for a sleep study at that point. That was obvious. But a complete neurological examination that typically takes place in the doctor's office, and it's a series of tests. A lot of them are questions that you might be asked during the course of a regular office visit, and you might not even know that you're being tested or assessed. They'll be looking for mental status. They'll be looking for the function of the cranial nerves. I don't really know how they do that. You'll be probably asked to take a few steps and touch your nose and do a couple of things to test coordination, balance, walking, your reflexes, sensory nerves, your autonomic nervous system. Any abnormalities that are noted during the course of that evaluation would then help your doctor know what kind of testing might be called for. So where do we go from there? What kinds of tests are available? You should know about these so that you can say, hey, what about this test? Or why are you choosing this test and not this test? And I would encourage you, because I'm an upstart, to enter into that dialogue with your doctor and not just blindly trust any one medical person. My opinion, like I said, I'm a troublemaker. Okay, genetic testing. A number of these illnesses may have genetic markers. I would say that testing is probably not the first place for you to go if you do not have a first level relative, a sibling, a parent, possibly a grandparent who has Parkinson's or who has had a journey with dementia, specifically if you knew that it was a journey with Lewy body dementia. Probably you don't need genetic testing, at least not right out of the gates, if there's no other family history. But it is testing that's available, and I believe that there are 3 with Parkinson's and 1 specifically with Lewy body dementia, most associated with those illnesses, but there's a total of about 7 different genetic markers that have some kind of relevance. Sleep study. That was the first step for me. It made sense. If you're having insomnia, if you're having any acting out of dreams, if you're having excessive daytime sleepiness, you may want to consider asking for or opening yourself up to the possibility of having that. And I have done a separate video about it, so you can go back and look at the My Sleep Study Experience. I believe it's chapter 3 that talks about what's involved in that test, why you would go and have it, and what REM sleep behavior disorder is all about, how it manifests in me anyway, and why it's significant for these diagnoses. Then there's a bunch of imaging. Probably one or the other of these, maybe more than one of these, will be recommended at some point for you. things you should know is that most of these are considered nuclear testing, which means you are injected with a small amount of a radioactive isotope that then there needs to be a period of time, depending on the test. It could be an hour, it could be a day, where this needs to circulate throughout your body. And then you would go submit to a scan of some kind with an imaging machine that will then pick up the presence of those isotopes in various parts of your body, typically the brain, in order to make a pathology report. So different kinds of testing. There's the DTI, which means diffusion tensor imaging test. That's an MRI with a contrast. I don't know if that is a radioactive. That might just be a typical contrast. So it's an MRI type test. It analyzes white matter in the brain. And in doing so, that can help to detect traumatic brain injury. It can detect MS, brain tumors, age-related degenerations, and some other conditions. So this would potentially be an age-related degeneration. There would be an increase of white matter in the brain, which may indicate a compromise to the protective coating that goes around the nerves in the brain. So there is something called white matter disease. I don't know a lot about it, so I'm throwing a bunch of words at you there. But the DTI test would look for those kinds of things. So you would be injected with a contrast dye, and that's about 1 to 2 hours. It's not considered a first-line test for these particular illnesses that we're talking about, but it is a test that exists. The one that was considered pretty much the definitive test until about a year or a year and a half ago was called a DaT scan, DAT, and that stands for dopamine transporter scan. So that uses a machine called a SPECT scanner, and SPECT is another acronym for a bunch of fancy words. In this case, you're injected with a radioactive dye, and that is specifically the DaT scan to test for the dopamine function and blood flow in your brain, particularly in the areas of your brain that control movement. So since we know that Parkinson's has to do with a depletion of dopamine in the basal ganglia, it's going to go look there and it's going to see exactly what the dopamine is doing in that portion of the brain. So that's super useful. So it can help distinguish between Parkinson's disease, Lewy body dementia, Alzheimer, and essential tremor. So that one test alone could say it is this, it is not this. It's considered reliable to about 85%. So it can be flawed, but it also can be helpful. And I have seen a number of people in the support groups express some frustration and disappointment because their DaT scan was negative or normal, and it was unable to detect anything that could be attached to the experience that they were having, and that can be frustrating. So either, there's a margin for error with the test, and at the same time, depending on when you get tested. So that is to say, if you are tested too early, it may not register the results that you're wanting. So that's another data point to be discussing with your care team. Like, is this the right time for me to have this test? And of course, if you're having symptoms, you're like, give me the test. At least I am. I want it all. And I'm only now beginning to think, maybe I shouldn't be pushing for all of these tests because I am so early in the process. Why would I subject myself to an increased amount of radiation going through my system if it's going to end up not giving me the information that I'm after? So things to consider, and how you feel about being injected with radioactive isotopes to begin with. That's maybe something that just is you're not willing to do. I just recently took my mom for a PET scan, which is the next thing that I'm going to talk about. And they told her, you're going to be radioactive for a while, so stay away from small children for, 3 or 4 hours after this test. Oh my goodness. Apparently I was not at risk, so I took her to lunch. In any event, the DaT test was the most common test to diagnose Parkinson's disease and I guess Lewy body dementia before the Syn-One test, which is the one that I'm going to talk about last. That's the little icing on my cupcake here. This test takes about 3 to 6 hours, and that's because you need to be injected with the isotopes and then you need to wait. They usually put you in a comfy room and they just ask you to sit quietly for an hour or so waiting for that to move through your system before they do the scan. And as I said, it's accurate to about 85%. So PET scans, positron emission tomography is what PET stands for. It also involves a radioactive dye that is injected, and this test shows how the organs and the tissues are working in your body. Most people associate PET scans with detection of tumors, and that is much of the time what we are looking for. But in other cases, it can be used, in this case, to actually look at how active dopamine is in the brain. So it can help to confirm Parkinson's disease or Lewy body dementia. It's not usually part of the dementia assessment unless it's used in combination with some other imaging like CT scans or MRIs, but it is considered a supportive biomarker. So if you have one or more of the core symptoms and you had a PET scan result that was positive for dopamine functioning poorly in the brain, that would be clinically significant. But it may not be the test that your doctor is going to order like right off the bat because of these factors. So this test takes about 2 hours. You'll be injected with the dye. You'll be taken to the comfy room for a little while. You'll be scanned. You might be mildly radioactive for a couple of hours afterward. So there is another test. This one is being used in other countries more than it's being used here in order to diagnose Parkinson's and Lewy body dementia. Now, it is effective, and it was considered less expensive, I think, is the reason that they started looking at this particular test. But and I thought that I might be interested in this rather than some of these other tests until I read that instead of taking a couple of hours, this takes a couple of days to complete this test. It's called the MIBG, and that stands for meta-iodobenzyl guanide. Maybe I said that right. It's a myocardial scintigraphy scan. So it's a heart scan. So they're looking for heart function and the nerves in the heart. So typically it's a test that's used by cardiologists, but the MIBG is the substance that they are actually injecting into you. And sometimes that substance is also used therapeutically. They inject it into you, and then they take a look at how that affects the nerves that control your heart. And since dementia with Lewy body affects those very same nerves, it would allow the test to help distinguish between dementia with Lewy body and other diseases. So if we're seeing a compromise and we know that dementia with Lewy body affects those specific nerves in the heart, that would point toward dementia with Lewy body as opposed to something like Alzheimer's or another dementia. So that's interesting that it can do that and that it's an alternative to some of the other imaging we've talked about. It's accurate to about 85% in differentiating dementia with Lewy body from Alzheimer's disease. But what happens is you get injected with the MIBG on day one, and then you go home for a day. You rest a lot, you drink a lot of water, you've got all this stuff in your body, and I honestly don't know if that's radioactive or not. Then you go in the next day for your scans, and there may be multiple scans. I'm not 100% sure what that substance is. I mean, by the description, it said meta-iodobenzyl guanide or guanide. So I would have to look up each one of those words, but I know iodine is one of them. That's the iodo. I just didn't do the deep dive on that one because after seeing that it took 2 days, I decided that this was not a test that I would prefer over some of the others. Not thrilled about any of the radioactive imaging options. However, if there is a compelling reason to go for it, I would partake. As I said, I'm very early in the process, and this last test that I'm going to talk about, for me, will seal the deal. So if I just needed one of those other tests in order to secure the diagnosis that I need, which would give me perhaps access to certain clinical trials or certain treatments that I would not have access to without a formal diagnosis, then I could be compelled to take one of these tests. However, in, I think, 2023, based on research funded by the Michael J. Fox Foundation, a new test became available, and the choir sang. It's called the Syn-One Test, and what that is a skin puncture biopsy. So you go to the doctor's office, they have a kit that they've procured from the lab. And if your doctor has not performed this test before, it also comes with a little video that's instructional. I've actually watched the video, and it talks about exactly how the test is to be administered and what you do. It's a very simple skin puncture biopsy. And they take a little piece of tissue from 3 specific parts of your body. So back here by your neck, and then one in your thigh, and then one near your ankle. And it's just a little syringe where they make a little puncture, and then they extract a little piece of tissue, and they suspend it in a fluid in a little test tube, and then they send it off for the pathology to be done. What it detects, I'm not quite sure exactly why those 3 areas are significant, but apparently it's been determined that those are great spots to determine whether there's an accumulation of these alpha-synuclein proteins. They will clump together and they will show up in the skin. The other way that you can find out about whether you have these alpha-synuclein clumps, these Lewy bodies are what they are called when they clump together and get in the way of things. They can show up in the skin. They can also be detected in the spinal fluid. But I don't know about you, having had one spinal tap in my life, I never, ever want to go through that experience again. So unless there's some compelling reason that you would have to go that route in order to get this result, I would discourage you from rushing to get yourself a spinal fluid extraction. Just don't. But a very simple skin puncture, minimally invasive. You might have a little bit of soreness. There'll be a local anesthesia, like a lidocaine injection, in order to make that comfortable. You might have a little bit of discomfort because it is a puncture after all, but certainly tolerable. And the results will come back in about 15 to 21 days. The accuracy of detecting the alpha-synuclein, the Lewy bodies, is greater than 95% in most cases. So if you ask me, that's the be all and the end all. Between that and the sleep study, I don't personally see a need for any additional testing in order to secure a diagnosis. If my neurologist disagrees, and based on the way he's been responding to me so far, I don't think he will disagree. We would discuss it further. And now I can go in here with my notes from this video and say, well, why? Help me understand more. And if that happens, of course, I'm going to let you know as well. So he wants to see me in the office for a clinical visit before actually performing the biopsy, probably because we haven't had a conversation face-to-face since my first visit where I talked about the sleep disorder, and so much has changed since then. So we'll have a nice conversation, and then we'll order the test. As things go with neurologists, that could take months, and I don't like that, but I may not have much choice about it. In the meantime, I'm not resting on my laurels, because come January 1, which is 2 days away, my insurance will change. Once I knew that I might be going down this path, we made an adjustment so that I would have an insurance that would be accepted by Mayo Clinic, and I happen to live in a city that has a Mayo Clinic. So my doctor, my primary care doctor, has already given me a referral to Mayo Clinic Neurology, and they also have a very distinct sleep medicine department with a very small staff there. But he put in a referral to both of those departments, and they originally told me they couldn't schedule an appointment for me because my insurance was not accepted by them. But it will be in a couple of days, and then I'm going to do my very best in order to see if I can get seen by them. The research that's going on at Mayo is interesting to me. They even have a program, they have a brain bank there where they store tissue for research, and they accept donations. So at some point in the future, I may want to actually make this aging adult neurodegenerated brain available to science for further study. That's really what I am about at this point. Is like, use me. I want to be a voice. I want to be the face of early detection. I want to be somebody who advocates with every ounce of energy that I can muster on any given day going forward for advancing the research, making information and resources available to other people, helping to cut through the confusion. And just for me, that gives me having this affliction meaning. Otherwise, what else do I have to do but sit around and just wallow? Not going to lie, there are days that are pretty depressing, and there are days where it's tough. But in the meantime, I want to thank you very much for joining me on this ride. I would love to hear from you in the comments about what you're getting benefit from, what I'm not covering that you might like me to look into. I'm just, honestly shooting from the hip and talking about the things that are meaningful to me right now, but I would be interested to know what is meaningful to you and what resources maybe you have found that have been helpful or things that you're continuing to be confused about. I don't have all the answers. I'm not the be all and the end all, but I am willing to use my energy in combination with your energy to move the ball. So let's do that together. I want to wish you a very happy, very healthy new year. Let's take a deep breath and let's lean in together. Thank you for being with me on this journey. Really.